All right, so we're going to start, and I am the child of public school teachers, so I can talk over anyone, including all of you here today. And what Rip said, I'll introduce folks properly in just a second, but Rip reminded me as we were walking in that I had said yesterday about sort of the concept of the most interesting conversations happen in the hallway. And the three of us just had a really good hallway conversation about the topic of this panel. Yep. And so the challenge we've given ourselves is if we can do it again on stage in front of all of you. And I've got my eye on Rip's colleagues at Kresge, so if I see anyone having an aneurysm, I'll know that we're sort of approaching that, okay. Right? We're actually getting to the really interesting conversations. So, I am still Jamie Bennett, the executive director of ArtPlace. And the thing that I will just sort of lift up for the purposes of this panel is before I was at ArtPlace, I spent 4 years working in the Obama administration at the National Endowment for the Arts, and 3 years before that working in Mayor Bloomberg's administration in New York City government. And next to me is Anika Goss-Foster, who is the executive director of Detroit Future Cities. And before that had a long and extraordinary time at LISC, not long, short, extraordinary time at LISC as vice president for the Midwest region after spending some time running the Detroit office. And before that even, you were running an office of philanthropy within the city of Detroit. So also has sort of both the public and the private. And to Anika's left is Rip Rapson, who is most importantly chair of the ArtPlace Funders Council, and also president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation. And before that, spent 4 years as a deputy mayor and spent some time as a lawyer working with nonprofits. So the thing that I'm really excited about is that each of us has been on sort of every side of that public-private equation. And so I'm asking all three of us to show up with sort of all of ourselves and all of our hats. And there are sort of two short stories that I would like to share to sort of kick off what it is we're trying to do. And the first goes back a few years when I was talking with a colleague, Laura Sparks, who was running the William Penn Foundation at that point. And I asked her my favorite question to ask when I'm meeting people, which is, what is the biggest mistake that our generation is making? Right? All of us think that we're bending the arc a little bit more towards the good. And all of us will have grandchildren who will look at us and say, what were you thinking, right? Generations ago, we knew that people needed to not live next to where they worked. They needed lawns, they needed sky. We had these magical things called cars, so we're going to invent the suburbs, right? And now we think that that was not necessarily the best thing to do. So I asked Laura Sparks what she thought the biggest mistake our generation was making, and she said, without hesitation, public-private partnerships. That we're entering into them, that people are taking whatever money is offered to do whatever it is that the money is offered to do, and we're not having an explicit or a transparent conversation around what is actually the job of government, what is the role of private dollars, what is the role of accountability. The second thing that I will share is actually a tweet that I shared with both of you, which is Fast Company tweeted out an article a couple months ago with the sentence, "This startup lets neighbors pool their money to invest in their communities." And a reporter who tweets as Natalie Shirley tweeted back, "Hey, some tech bros just accidentally invented taxes." So that's the conversation we want to have, right? Do we actually need to reinvent taxes through public-private partnerships? You know, we could look at the case, we have colleagues here from New Orleans, which has opted to go entirely private with their transportation system, with their system of schools. We could look at the US prison system, which has a lot of public-private partnerships that I think we would all agree are sort of not for the good. But given who I'm on stage with, we're actually going to take as our case, we're at least going to start with a jumping off point of the city of Detroit. And just to sort of set a moment of context at the beginning of this, last year, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, there was about $67 million in private money that was raised by the city of Detroit, and that compares with a $1.9 billion budget. So I think Detroit is a city that a lot of us think as being shaped by these partnerships, shaped by philanthropy, shaped by the private sector, and there's a lot that isn't, right? Just sort of purely on the numbers. So, as a way to dive in, Anika, I'd love to sort of start with you. Detroit Future City is a little bit of an odd duck with a history over its 8 years, 7 years of existence.
Yeah.
So can you share a little bit of that history, what it is today, and sort of what it was like when you arrived?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And I'm really excited to be here. Who was from Detroit before I get started? All right, good. So you can verify or say she's lying. It didn't happen like that. If I take you back to 2010, which I think is really, really important in Detroit, because in 2010, we'd had 3 mayors in a year and a half. And the city was essentially broke, right? Like lights weren't on. It was taking forever for the basic fundamental systems. In the 25 years that I've lived and worked in Detroit as an adult, it was the first time where I was anxious being in and around the city in 2010. And so the response, and this was also prior to bankruptcy or receivership, the response was the private sector, both the corporate sector and philanthropy, partnering with the mayor at the time, Dave Bing, to do something big to both fix and to long-term plan. And I think that was sort of the birth of Detroit Future City. And I can go into all of the mistakes that were made in terms of who's in control and the idea of shutting off neighborhoods.
Go into one mistake. Just name one mistake.
Okay, one mistake is, the biggest mistake that I think we're still paying for was this idea of closing off neighborhoods.
Yeah. And for folks who don't know Detroit deeply, just say a sentence about what that means.
So Detroit is 139 square miles, right? So it's just shy of Philadelphia in terms of the size. About 24 miles, and at the time it might have even been closer to more like 27 or 28 square miles of that 139 was vacant. And so that's a lot of land. And the response was to try to encourage people to move to more dense parts of the city and to actually fence off other areas that were vacant, and we would just sort of let those overgrow and we would only invest. And not only is it illegal in the state of Michigan to do that, you have to provide services to all parts of the city. But it's also, when you really think about it, to tell people that they have to move because they're poor is also unethical, immoral. And I know they weren't really thinking about it at the time, and I know the intention was really, let's try to make Detroit a better place for everybody. But the response was, are you telling me to move?
Right.
I'm not moving. And so that ended up, that was a hard way to start, right? And it made national news, and people are angry and frustrated by a lot of things. And they were angry, and so then there was a decision made to focus for the city to be able, and this was some investment from philanthropy, some investment from the corporate, to focus heavily on what was happening inside of the city of Detroit to make some fixes here, and so that we could get police, fire, trash picked up, lights on. Let's focus on those things. But then let's also focus heavily on long-term planning and community engagement, coupled with national expertise. And so anyone who was led by a national architect and planner, Tony Griffin, brought together a national team of experts and a local team of experts. And we were able to, and I say we, I wasn't a part of the process. Rip should probably say we, he was there. Engaged over 100,000 people in a long-term planning, a 50-year planning process for Detroit that focused on mostly land use, economic development, and the future of Detroit as a whole. And that process is what led to Detroit Future City. And there's a thick book. It's in the Smithsonian now as one of the largest public-private partnership processes in the country outside of an election. And the office now still tries to keep that same level of forward-thinking, the high level, intellectually led technical work, coupled with resident-led ideas, planning, opportunity. We have a storefront. People come to our offices and engage in planning, in land use work, in community and economic development work, in what's ever happening in their neighborhood that they want to talk about and engage in. And we focus on land use and sustainability, and we focus on community and economic development, and try to make it as clear as possible as a planning organization and think tank. We have an interesting relationship. I'm going on, so
No, keep going. No, because this is where it gets good.
Yeah, so we have that's what we do, and it's all really cool in the gang on the corner of West Grand Boulevard and 3rd Street in Detroit. But then the city, there's a new administration that's actually also very, very technical, lots of national experts for the first time in many, many years. And they have a highly functioning planning department. They have a highly functioning IT department. They have a highly functioning housing and revitalization department. They are rocking and rolling. And so now it's, okay, how do we live together? How do we actually operate together? Is it private partnership, or is it, do we compete? Are we angry, are we angry sisters at the sorority meeting? I mean, it can be really bad sometimes. And it can be really bad, but it also could be really great, because there's also an incredible opportunity for co-creation with the city as well.
Can I
Rip, go.
Can I gum up the works just a little bit?
Yeah.
So when I got a call from Mayor Bing in 2010, Mayor Bing had basically run on the platform of sealing off neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And he quickly discovered it was the third rail of politics. You just couldn't touch it. He was just singed. And so he called me and he said, Rip, we need to do just what New Orleans did. We need to get a master plan. Would you pay for a master planner, and we'll plop the master plan down and take care of it? I said, well, Mayor, I don't know if you've actually watched what happened in New Orleans, but they didn't quite get it right the first time, or the second time for that matter. They actually did a very different process from, I think, what traditionally municipal officials think of, which was to actually engage the community in a long-term, very complicated process. So anyway, we sent a bunch of people down there, spent a month down there, came back with a proposal that basically led to this top-down, bottom-up proposal. Yeah. Dinner with Tony Griffin convinced her to come from Cory Booker's shop in Newark and do this. I mentioned that because I think what happened over the next 4 or 5 years was a continual sort of negotiation of role. The mayor both knew he had $1.9 billion to spend and knew he couldn't deliver what he needed to do with all of the capital in the world. He needed community input. He needed sort of the philanthropic perspective that perhaps let him look at other places and other communities. And so when we began Detroit Future City, it ended up being a very sophisticated, exactly as Anika suggested. It was so sophisticated that the mayor's office decided they wanted nothing to do with it. And for a while, we had lodged Tony in the mayor's office. We had gone through 2 or 3 different planning directors to make sure that they were okay with having this sort of third wheel in their mix. And as they became more and more successful, as the community got more and more mobilized, the city became more and more defensive. They felt it was a repudiation of their skill. They felt these were external people telling the planning department what to do. They were coming up with recommendations that the city wasn't necessarily comfortable with. And so there was this complete distancing of the mayor's office from Tony and her team, to the point where we actually had to shut down the process for an entire year, pull it out of the mayor's office, and finally realized that the level of community engagement was so strong, and the community essentially was saying, you've been working with us for 2 years and you're just going to turn this thing off? Why don't you let the community own it? So we created a sort of a community ownership model, and over the next year we finished the plan. And at the press conference, I don't remember if the mayor was even at did the mayor come? I think the mayor may have come. By then, he kind of figured out that it was a good idea for him to come. But we had 100 people on the stage who had been what we called process leaders from the city, all community-based folks who basically said, this is our plan. And so we actually walked into the new administration where, after the bankruptcy, essentially when Mayor Duggan took over, there was a real question about whether this new administration would embrace this sort of externally generated plan. And the answer was yes, for a while. Because then the same dynamic started kicking in. All of a sudden, we're in charge. This is somebody else's plan. It happened to be the community's plan, but it's somebody else's plan. And therefore, we're going to build our own planning department. We're going to create our own set of imperatives. And by the way, this office you've created should actually be absorbed. They're so talented. Anika wasn't there yet. They're so talented. Well, I didn't mean it that way. Yeah. They were about to get even more talented. But they were an extraordinarily talented group of young people. And they said, rather than build a planning department, we'll just grab you guys and bring them in. And we at Kresge, the primary funder, together with Ford and a couple of others, basically said, why don't we hold on that? Why don't we see what happens when you have external perspective that can kind of push you, that can sort of think in larger perspective. And at the end of a couple of years, if that doesn't work for you, Mayor of Detroit, then you've got the election certificate. We'll negotiate a different kind of solution. But I say all that, Jamie, because I think this is negotiated space. The public, the private, the philanthropic, the nonprofit, the civic is far more porous than it used to be. And I remember when I began in philanthropy a number of years ago, philanthropy wouldn't get anywhere near public sector stuff. It wouldn't get anywhere near private sector stuff. Private sector stuff was sort of tainted. That was for-profit stuff. We weren't in that business. Public sector is way too messy, way too complicated, way too political. And I think it's only been in the last number of years that you've gotten this kind of impulse toward trying to figure out what happens when there is a sorting and a negotiation and a modulation and a porousness to these things that tries to figure out, if you're aiming at a problem, who does what the best? Mm-hmm. And then sort of line up behind that problem. And I think, in fairness, largely because of Anika's sort of integrity, in this particular instance of land use and long-term planning and citizen engagement, we've been able to sort of create roles and responsibilities that actually fit and aren't sort of at each edges.
But so let me push on that exact point with both of you, because where does the job, right, you created a great community-owned plan. In a representational democracy, that is the work of a city's planning department.
Why?
Because isn't that the system of, right, don't we have community ownership of our government? Isn't that the right vehicle or no? I mean, but so this is where I want you to push back and talk about where does the role of city government stop and when does it need the angry sorority sister?
Yeah, so I think that the way to really think about it is we're fortunate to have, and I'm saying this outside of me being here because I will not be here for 50 years, right? Let's just be clear. But having an organization whose sole focus is the future of a better Detroit for the next 50 years on behalf of Detroit residents is a real value add, right? And what's so critical to that is that we're not a part of the city. We're not a part of any administration. So no matter who sits on the 11th floor at the City of Detroit in the mayor's office, there will always be a Detroit Future City that will focus on strong planning, good design, resident engagement, and will continue to ask questions over the next 50 years. So we would push, if the next administration may not be really interested in planning at all. Right. That's up to that mayor, right? Mm-hmm. But it would be Detroit Future City and all of the people who we work with to say, hey, wait a minute, we need strong urban planning because this area over here is what the city needs to be about the actual planning and design, right? And so I think that's sort of the dance that has to happen over time.
And why isn't it, so Rip, why isn't it the job of a city to have a 50-year vision? Isn't that why we're electing people?
It's one of many reasons we elect people. But I think everybody does things with sort of differential impact. And I think the fact, Anika's right, I mean, the fact that we have a high-powered, high-functioning planning department is all to the good. They are made better every day by what Anika does. I think they are made better every day by what philanthropy does. And at the end of the day, if you have to levy a tax or zone a parcel, that is their prerogative. They ultimately win that conversation.
That's right.
But the smarter we can be, the more engaged we can be, and the more community voice we can have in the mix, I think the better they perform their job. Part of the problem, and I think this, I don't mean to get into the esoterica of Detroit, but part of the problem before this administration was their version, the public sector's version of community engagement wasn't anything anyone in this community would recognize. It was very command and control. Mm-hmm. And ironically, the roles were flipped, where an anti-democratic institution like philanthropy had to go out and figure out ways to try to make sure that community voice was on the table. Again, it couldn't drive taxation policy or even regulatory regimes, but it could put another perspective on the table and hope that the force of that perspective would help people be more thoughtful, have sort of longer term vision, and ultimately deliver a product that was more embraceable by the community as a whole. This administration does that better, but I would argue that they still don't do it very well. They still really struggle with what it means to do community engagement between getting 1,000 people in a gymnasium with a microphone. I mean, one of the things that Anika's staff did just transcendently well was figure out, almost like a political campaign, how do you organize in barbershops and basements and online and through direct old-fashioned knocking on doors. And so there was this wonderful sort of fabric of devices to try to get people into the mix in a way that was meaningful to them. I think the public sector struggles with that. And again, it's not our job to take away that role. It's just, I think, part of our job to help expose them to another way of working and hope that over the longer term, bit by bit by bit, we all just sort of climb the ladder of efficacy.
I think that's great. So let's turn to an even more difficult case. Let's talk about transportation in Detroit.
Oh.
And let's talk about the Q line. Right?
Anika, what do you think?
So, Anika, no, let me give you the easy question, Anika. Just for those of us who are not from Detroit, just tell us what the Q line is in the most neutral terms possible.
Right, so the Q line it's a streetcar. So it's about 3.2 miles from downtown. Detroit really, the historic Detroit has two downtowns. One is at the river, and then the other was 3 miles north of that where General Motors' original headquarters was. And so it's a historic, it's a very small, maybe 6 buildings downtown called New Center. And so the Q line goes from downtown, the streetcar, both ways from downtown to New Center and stops along the way.
Excellent. Nicely done.
Okay.
So, Rip, but the story is slightly more complicated than that, right?
You think?
How was it paid for? How was it decided? How did the Q line come to be?
In many ways, it emerges from the same milieu that Anika described. In the sort of, when I arrived in Detroit in 2006, the zeitgeist was actually quite positive. We had just elected this really dynamic young mayor called the hip-hop mayor. He had been elected when he was 31. There were cranes on the skyline, and people were feeling that this was really Detroit's time. And 2 years later, our mayor turned out to be kind of a little bit more complicated than he appeared. He ended up being indicted together with 50 of his closest friends.
75, actually.
75? Mm-hmm. No.
He was only friends with 50.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. 25 hangers on.
Yeah.
So that happened to coincide with the bankruptcy filings of the automobile industry, which employ, I don't know, small number, 400, 500,000 people in the upper Midwest, coupled with the foreclosure crisis, coupled with the recession. And so, in a way, philanthropy had absolutely no choice but to say, are we going to step up and try to help stabilize our community until people can resume their rightful roles? Because you had the private sector in a bunker, the public sector in the penitentiary, and the nonprofit sector kind of hanging on by a thread. And so it was really what I mentioned earlier, Jamie. It was this sort of notion that, are we actually going to sort of engage in the public realm? Are we actually going to try to do things that might entice the private sector to reinvest and get back into the mix? And one of the things that became central to that was the idea that as much as our strategies for trying to help Detroit get back on its feet were focused on Detroit, small business development, housing, arts and culture, education reform, ultimately jobs became the litmus. And at that point, the economic base of Detroit was so fragile that the only way I think anybody who thought about it could imagine sort of recalibrating the relationship of Detroit to the region was to try to connect Detroiters to jobs. And until we were able to grow jobs in the core, we just simply had to figure out a way to connect to the job centers of the region. And this was a central tenet of the Detroit Future City planning process. It was repeated to us in neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood. And so to make a really complicated story short, Kresge put the first $50 million on the table to jumpstart a light rail project, not because we wanted to run a trolley car between the river and Midtown, but because it became the first move in a larger civic armature that could provide regional transit and regional connection. Because if you could actually go from downtown on the river to Midtown, you would connect to a transit station that connected to Ann Arbor and through all of the job centers and the airport, and connected to an existing rail line up into Birmingham and Troy, which is where the job centers are. So all of a sudden, you had essentially the armature of a regional system. And if we were to do that, we might actually have a running shot at freeing up federal transportation money. I remember talking to Roy LaHood when we began this project, and I said,
Former U.S. Secretary of Transportation.
Former Secretary of Transportation under President Obama. And he said, well, you have a slight problem. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, we have what's called a New Starts list, which is a list of communities that are eligible for federal transportation dollars. And there are 521 cities on that list. And I said, well, so? He said, well, you're number 521. And he said, so unless you can figure out a way to move, to create a proof point somewhere in your system that can represent a match to these federal dollars, you're never going to access the kind of money you need to build out bus rapid transit or rail to the airport or whatever it is you have in mind to create this kind of regional connection you're talking about. And so the light rail was always intended to be that first move. In the process, it is done, I think, and it was intended to do what has happened in so many places around America, which is to create fixed point stops that generate economic development. And in fact, over the last 5 or 6 years, that has happened, and I can sound like the Chamber of Commerce there. But in short form, in the last 5 years alone, we've seen almost $7 billion of investment just along the line. And so the question, I think, is can we then move to the next level and sort of complete the system and begin to realize the promise of sort of the larger regional gesture that we always intended.
So, Anika, you and I had talked a little bit about this, and you had brought up the economic development play, right? You said, this is classic transit-oriented development, we're getting it, that's fabulous. Mm-hmm. If I'm living not in the core of Detroit, if I'm living in one of the neighborhoods, how am I benefiting from either the transit or the economic development?
Well, I mean, well, right now you're just really not, I mean, from the Q line. The Q line isn't designed to provide transportation to Detroiters in its entirety, right? It's really sort of an economic engine from downtown to New Center. And I think everybody's pretty clear on that. Mm-hmm. The bigger problem is that this vision that Rip just described was stunted, there really isn't. And while the city, part of their plan was to improve the bus system, and so the buses now operate on time. Mm-hmm. But if you're living at 8 Mile, which is the top at 8 Mile on the east side, which is the top right-hand corner, it's literally 12 miles to go from that top corner to downtown where your doctor's office might be or where your job might be. And if you don't have a car, which the majority of Detroiters don't have a car, then you can't get to that job. And so we're still really not solving that problem, and it cripples Detroit. And so that's the inside. And going outside, you're still at your house up on the east side. You'd have to take a bus, which would take about 30 to 45 minutes from your house at 8 Mile downtown, transfer there to take the bus to the SMART bus that has the SMART bus comes to Detroit once. And so that you could take that bus from downtown to the edge of Detroit along Woodward, and then take the regional bus up to your job in Birmingham. So now it's like an hour and a half.
Right. On a good day.
On a good day, if everything is working.
Right.
And so this is a truly equity issue for Detroiters, because we are not only just the last city in the United States that doesn't have some form of formal transportation beyond the old city bus system, but it is also, because we're still a city of 80% African American and a growing Latino population, we're also crippling, it becomes also this racial equity issue that I don't think that we can just pretend like it's not actually happening, where it feels like we're keeping African Americans and Latinos from prospering the way they could in the rest of the region, just because we can't get them to work.
Right. And Jamie,
Yeah.
I was just going to say, you asked earlier about, in some ways, isn't there an argument to be made that we should be more deferential to our public officials? So as part of the light rail, we passed for the first time in 45 years a package of legislation that created a regional transit authority.
And we as the state,
I'm sorry,
we as the county.
We as the 3 counties, the 4 counties essentially surrounding Detroit. And the state legislature adopted this package that permitted the region to create this system, to levy taxes in support of it, and to design a plan. That was all done last fall. It failed during the sort of the wave of last presidential election. And so we're coming at it again. And just this morning, you would think a regional leader, public leader, would say to Anika, you're right. Our suburban system doesn't really reach, it can't even reach down into the city. Therefore, we need some kind of integrated system. And therefore, I'm willing to let the voters of my county vote on that. Just this morning, the 2 counties to the north basically said, no, we're not going to even let you vote on this proposition. And so in that case, we could, I suppose, defer to the prerogative of a county elected executive, or we could go at them with everything we've got, right? And so I just think this is one of those times when the system gets out of balance. Right. And again, philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, can't put something on the ballot in Detroit. It has to go through the electeds. Right. But can we create all the pressure we possibly can and make all of the arguments we possibly can and underwrite all of the community advocacy we can and make all of the arguments about equity that we can and hope that that sort of changes the equilibrium? I think that's, yes, it is sort of classic pluralism. I think.
Yeah, well, but let's push a little bit further, and I'm sort of in mind of the, the Colin Powell Pottery Barn doctrine, right? It's sort of, if you break it, you bought it, right? So philanthropy came in with $50 million and said, we're going to reinforce the existing inequity in the city, right? We're going to create rail during the center where there's already a lot of investment. And we're going to hope. Let me just. And we're going to hope. We're going to hope that reaches the neighborhoods.
No.
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 So what happened?
I think everybody knew that wasn't going out to the neighborhoods.
No. I mean, we.
So whose job is it to fix that?
It's all of our jobs to fix that. I mean, it's not. I think Detroiters are very nuanced in their understanding that this is not binary. that every dollar you generate in the core is a dollar the city can put to use in the neighborhoods. And I think Mayor Duggan has actually done a spectacular job of saying, at the same time we build arenas and arts complexes and all the other things that we're building up and down, you've got to make the pivot fully and with huge intentionality to make sure that those incremental dollars are going for housing stabilization, new commercial corridor development, parks, schools, and the like. And so, I mean, I know you're trying to be provocative, but I don't think we ever intended the rail to be at the expense of neighborhoods. It was a first step in a long series and a complicated integrative series of moves that ultimately held the city as a whole. Because again, if you can't create a regional system and you're up in Brightmoor, I don't know how ultimately we can create enough job generation in the short term to make sure that a mom in Brightmoor can get to a hospital that's not in her neighborhood.
Yeah, I want to jump in here too. So the Q line, in my opinion, is not, this is not a win-lose game here. This is, the Q line as a rail system is part of the economic development strategy for downtown, midtown, and New Center. Because even though those are the fastest growing areas of Detroit, they're not done by any means. So you have to be able to continue to grow your economic center so that the rest of the city can grow. That's just pure economic development basics. I personally see the transportation problem that we have in Detroit as separate from that. Even though they're both transportation, the transportation problem, the idea that, and what we talked about in the Detroit Future City Framework was even a sub-shuttle that would complement the existing bus system. And we were very explicit that the expectation isn't that Detroit will suddenly come up with $100 billion and suddenly we'll have subways and rail above and below and all of that. We just need something to get us faster from 8 Mile to downtown and everywhere in between, all throughout the city, and that can get us to the regional system. That's a very different transportation. And that is the public-private challenge, right? And I love the title of this session, by the way. Who's the boss? You're not the boss of me. I feel like I have that kind of conversation every day.
Right.
Because so then I might say to the city, this is why we need even a shuttle to get people around that would follow the bus system. And you need to do it. That's your job. And they would say, you're not the boss of me to do that. And then they would say to me, stop telling people that they need transportation on the east side because we're focusing on Livernois and 6 Mile first on the west side. And I'll say, well, you're not the boss of me either, you know? So we have these kinds of these conversations, but I did want to make that point.
Yeah.
They're two different.
Well, so I want to ask you guys to dream for a second and sort of to look ahead rather than look back. And then I want to get folks in this room, because we've got a lot of smart people in this room who have a lot to say. So we're going to run some mics around and spend sort of the last 20 minutes in conversation with you guys. But at the moment, there is no sort of local government presence for arts and culture in Detroit. Is that true? It's true.
There's no, you're right.
So there's an opportunity here, right? That nothing's been built yet, nothing's been done yet. So if we're going to think about public-private partnerships, and we're going to think about arts and culture, and we're going to think about what government should be doing and what other folks should be doing, be it nonprofits, be it philanthropies, how should we begin thinking about that as you look ahead, as you dream, as you have a chance to get things right, even righter, as you think about the next thing? How should we be thinking about that?
I think the reason I continue to squirm, is we have a number of planners in this very superb planning department who are deeply committed to arts and culture and who are, I think, using their best efforts to make sure that arts, culture, design, heritage are all on the front burner of the redevelopment efforts of the city and the renewal efforts of the city. And I think in many ways they're doing a really good job. Maurice Cox, who is our planning director, is just phenomenal. He ran the Design Center in New Orleans. He has a sensibility about these questions. And
He was
so,
at the National Endowment for the Arts.
National Endowment for the Arts. He's just top drawer, and I think is at every turn trying to figure out how to make sure that the sensibilities and the practicalities of being an artist are front and center to the department. Having said that, there is so much sort of indigenous energy in Detroit in the arts and cultural scene. People who I think came 10 years ago where there really were no rules and created their own and were pioneers in all sorts of ways. And people who had been in the community for a very long time who had become accustomed to sort of a free territory. And that's becoming more complicated. And so the reason I hesitate about what that mediating presence should be is that you have this sort of enormous creative energy going on in the community, growing more and more artists every day in Detroit, as opposed at potential tension with the bureaucratization of a city's function. And I think in many ways we've got it sort of right now in the sense that the planning department is doing its job. It is actually hiring people with the kinds of vision around arts and culture that permit them to interface with this energy in a way that's not overly bureaucratic, but sort of is empowering and enabling. I just worry that at some point, as the community, as the city's government gets better organized, more top-down, it becomes more and more tempting to become the boss of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I worry a little bit that we're kind of about to enter that phase. And I think you can cut it either way. You could either say, well, let's let just good people continue to kind of modulate in this complicated space, or you might say, don't we actually need a mediating institution, a little bit like Detroit Future City, that on an ongoing basis advocates for capacity building in the arts, capacity building in arts organizations? And I'm not sure I have quite the answer to that.
Yeah, and just the shade that I'll just add, and then would love for you to respond, is I haven't read the entire Detroit Future City plan, but I've read the executive summary. I have a liberal arts degree. I don't read books, I read book reviews. And I don't remember arts and culture being very visible in it. Right, it's in there, but I don't. There's not a chapter heading. There's not a major thing. So if I'm an arts and culture entity in Detroit, I don't really have representation in government. I don't yet necessarily have great visibility in Detroit Future City. How should I be thinking about that?
Well, I actually think that, well, so first of all,
and correct anything that I'm wrong about.
Yeah, I think while there isn't an explicit chapter on arts and culture, design, good, design that incorporates art into neighborhoods is throughout, and that is in every chapter.
Right.
So a lot of what we do partners with Design Core, which is part of the UNESCO World Heritage Design, a number of the institutions. But there are other elements where we've probably fallen short. So I've had people stop me on the street. That's the great thing about being such an inclusive, part of an inclusive process. People can say anything to you, right? Someone from the techno music industry said to me, "We're not in the plan, and you don't have a plan for us." And I was like, "Oh yeah, you're kind of right. Why don't you come on down to the shop and we'll try to figure something out." But I would say that good design, strong design, how do we incorporate visual arts into every neighborhood is actually a part of the framework. What I would say though about the, how do you link the public sector to design? I think a lot of the people who are in the design community, who are in the fine arts community and culture community in Detroit would say, please don't, right? Like they would say, we do not want to be a part of the city of Detroit beast for them to now put all kinds of policy on art and design and what that looks like by neighborhoods. On the other hand, on the other side of that, a city that leads with art and culture and design is probably what they would really want. You know, like maybe it's not a whole department that is making decisions, but maybe it's a chief and somebody else who works for that person that can prioritize it on a regular basis and gives it this level of visibility. There's a really interesting tension right now between what is art, right, and murals, murals versus graffiti art, and places, especially places on vacant structures in the city. And that's a really, they could use a mediator. That is really where they need somebody on the inside to be able to say, this is art, this is what we want, this is how this community has come together and really wants our art to look like this and to be a part of this community. And this has happened a number of times.
That's great. We have mic runners somewhere, and I can't really see with the lights. Stephanie's in the back. We have someone right down front, if we could bring a mic here, and then someone right behind. And would love to invite you to join us. Just say a word about who you are and then join us in conversation.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Hey.
My name is Faith Bartley. I'm from the Village Arts and Humanities in Philadelphia, probably in the heart of North Philly. And one of my concerns when listening to you guys talk about the transportation, and in my opinion, it seems like it's kind of sort of like redlining people, like separating the people of color, Latinos and blacks, from not being able to get in the district where maybe more affluent people are, and it's kind of like keeping them separated. And I also want to talk about murals, real important. Philadelphia has been dubbed the city of murals,
Yes.
you know, and the city of living arts, and I feel real proud to be a part of Philly, born and raised, and been doing this kind of nonprofit work with helping raise voices through art, using art as a vehicle. And it's been working out pretty good. Like, I run a women's and reentry program to help formerly incarcerated women. And we push policy through art, you know what I mean? And so, transportation in Detroit, like, I've never been there, but it just seems like they're trying to separate people of color from the affluent trying to get down there, because it's like a holding them back. Like, if they can't get to work, then what are we going to create? Once again, mass incarceration, and it's something that I'm real passionate about.
Yeah,
That's
we are
all I got.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And one of the I think horrible things, just
Yeah, no, Stephanie, I think
I was just going to say, one of
right
the
here. Keep
horrible
going.
things about what's going on is that we're constantly inventing new ways to create that separation. So as we were developing this regional plan, the regional folks said, okay, you can have a regional plan that connects Detroit and the suburbs, but each community will have the ability to opt out of that plan. Well, so all of a sudden, you're doing this, and it takes you every bit as long. And so it's not quite as obvious as redlining, but the effect is exactly the same.
I love this panel. I just want to say...
Just a word about who you are. and then join
I'm
us.
Elena Serrano. I'm from East Side Arts Alliance in East Oakland,
California.
which is a sister city to Detroit and Newark and Baltimore and all of those.
I went to Holy Names.
Yay.
I know Oakland.
But I love that you have a 50-year plan.
Yeah.
And we're very involved in a public-private partnership around a transportation thing in East Oakland. And I think the role of government, I tell you, the planning that you did in the community engagement is a service to the city. To remember that the city are public servants, and they need to hear from the neighborhood and the community to know how to serve them best. So you did that part, and now I feel like the role of the city is to implement. We have I think we fall back on the city just wants to continue to plan. You know, you don't need a new 50-year plan with each administration. That makes no sense. You need to implement, and you implement through zoning and taxes and land use decisions and things like that that support the plan. And then around culture, because culture's not in anything either. We have to like barge our way into these conversations. But the same things that work for artists, the same things that work for residents work for artists. You need spaces to thrive, spaces to communicate. And I love Jamie's initial thing at the opening about putting a big sum of money in the community's hands and letting them decide. And I guarantee you, the arts will flourish when the community gets to make those kind of decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And Anika, will you just say a word about implementation? How is the implementation of the 50-year plan coming along?
Yeah, well, we feel like it's coming. We're 5 years into implementation. So we spend a lot of time right now. I think we initially tried to like, page one, what did we say? And we stepped back from that. Because really the page one is how do we need to stabilize so that we can get to this future thinking of what Detroit is going to look like. We have to have a strategy for 24 miles of vacant land and a system for that before we can get into every neighborhood should have bioswales and solar arrays and community gardens on vacant land. Like we need to really understand how and so that's a lot of our implementation. Helping Detroiters really think about land differently. When you're 24 square miles of vacant land means that there is at least one vacant lot in every single block of Detroit. Every single block. So you have to think about land differently. You can't just ignore it. And so that's part of what we do. Understanding our system right now, like how we live. So Detroit is now a community of single family renters. We have more renters in Detroit than we have anyone else, but we're a town of single family housing. We don't have as much multifamily housing like other cities may. But in a city of single family renters, you actually it is a very different system for managing that property and making sure Detroiters are living in safe, clean, affordable, quality housing. So that's really what implementation looks like for us. That's just an example of a couple of things we're doing.
Stephanie's pointing at someone, so I'm going to trust you with the mic to know. Hi.
Thank you, panelists, for a great discussion. And my name is Gavin. I'm with a nonprofit in Utah called Utah Dene Bakea that is strangely similar to some of the neglected urban environments that we have. We're in a county that's 15,000 people. The majority, maybe 60%, are Native American. But they happen to live in a county where their tribal governments are in different states. They're in the farthest away county from the Utah government, and so it's actually a community that you could almost describe as not having been colonized yet. And there's 40% of people have no running water, no electricity. When it rains, kids can't go to school because the infrastructure is so horrible. My question to this group is, you've got a community vision down there. You have a people who have a sense of what their community should be, but they also recognize, these conditions can't continue to exist. And that word of community ownership, how do you do, when you've got communities that have never really seen effective government services show up, no private investments have ever happened, no philanthropy has ever existed there, and suddenly, they have one success of creating their vision of a protected landscape of Bears Ears National Monument. People are paying attention. Where do they go to avoid those oppressive forces that might come into play, and how do they lead it from the community level?
Ooh.
I think someone back there wants to answer the question.
Okay, good.
But I mean, so this to me is fascinating, right? Because we, in many ways, this is sort of overstating what you just said, but we don't have a bad government because we have neglectful government. We don't have philanthropy at all. We don't have the bureaucracy. We've got community voice.
Yeah.
We've got vision. And particularly given some of the colleagues I've met from that county, people have known for 11,000 years what needs to happen, right? We know what needs to work. We know how to make a sustainable community. We know how to live together. Those First Nations, those indigenous people have known that. So what do we do? What do we think about a place like that where all we need is implementation?
Well, part of the community process is being really clear about what it is that you want for your own quality of life, right? And while my work has not included indigenous communities, so I don't want to propose to have the answer, but what I do know is, you have to be really clear about what you want and what you want that to look like. So you're not opening the door to all kinds of new authorities, people in charge, new systems that that wasn't a part of what was of the conversation at all. So if you want if what it is that you want is new infrastructure and operating infrastructure, there has to be that negotiation up front about, let's think this all the way through. We don't just want to say we want new infrastructure and that's the end of it, because then we're going to have some government person who's now the director of all things infrastructure who gets to tell everybody what to do. That's not what you talked about either, right? And that actually was a part of that's been a real conversation even in an urban setting like Detroit, where people have said, we want these things, but these are also things that we can manage as well. And so this has to be this community negotiation for what we want and how we want it. So if we want affordable housing, as an example, if we say we want affordable housing in our neighborhoods, that doesn't mean we want a bunch of very stable shacks. We want quality, affordable housing that we can actually have families in that's more than 1.5 bedrooms, right, with barely a bath. We want a decent house because I have 4 children. And it's near school, and it's in a clean area. So it's that kind of negotiation that I think is a longer-term process, and it's a longer engagement on the public-private side of that equation.
And Rip, if you were going to sort of lay a bet, and you could sort of say, go all in on government, go all in on nonprofits, go all in on philanthropy, if you were thinking about sort of what's next for that county, is one of those sectors clearly the right answer?
Well, I think that is the right question, because I was thinking about when I was at McKnight in Minneapolis, we had sort of a statewide program that encompassed the native populations of the nations, and it was just a huge blind spot, because the Red Earth tribe, for example, worked with us for years to try to develop some kind of capital flow that would support their community-based priorities. They had gone through an elaborate planning process. They knew exactly what they felt their first dollar would go to and their 10th dollar would go to. And when the price tag came back, of course, it was just overwhelming. And we made a small contribution, but it didn't even begin to sort of catalyze the kind of change that the folks in Red Earth wanted. And then when you multiply that by 14 or 15 nations just in the state of Minnesota, and then you go to Utah and Idaho, and I just think this is a huge philanthropic blind spot. Other than the Bush Foundation and a handful of others, there are very few foundations that work in Native country. I think when we work there, we don't know how to answer that question. What's the relationship between the private and the public, and what's the public? I mean, is the public Idaho, or is the public the nation's governance structure? How presumptuous can philanthropy be? Should we just simply turn capital over? And the answer is probably yes, but philanthropy is not very good at that.
Right.
And the private sector, of course, doesn't have a clue about what to do in Native America. And so I wish I had an answer for that, but I do think that somewhere, somehow, philanthropy as a whole has got to try to get its act together around what it can and can't do. I mean, are there some things that we can do that would be beneficial, perhaps not in every nation, but in some? Could we begin trying to create some proof points? Could we begin creating some sort of flexible capital that might be available for different purposes? I don't know. We're terrible at that at Kresge. I wish we don't touch Native communities at all, and I think that's true of most of our colleagues.
Well, you don't touch rural Native communities, but
Right.
urban Native communities,
Right, that's true.
you do.
Yes, we do.
So,
Yeah.
as well. All right, we have someone here. Emma Kiley's waving at me. Yes, please.
Hi, y'all. Thank you for your time. My name is Alberto Mejia. I'm from Austin, Texas. And what struck me while you're up there, well, first, for folks that know, Austin is kind of, when you talk about culture or creatives, there's kind of two, they're coded differently. You could say creative, and that means, tech startup, or the other one, you say I'm creative, and it's an organic artist that has had their life in Austin for generations. So it almost strikes me as the inverse of what you mentioned, Rip, is where the artists, after this intense saturation of incoming people, artists that probably didn't have any motive or interest in showing up to civics are now saying, it's a crisis, what can we do? We want to include us. So it was kind of like an inverse of that situation. So what strikes me is like, where's the opportunity maybe to create both autonomy and accountability, in these creative communities? And what is government and philanthropy's role in that? I'm kind of putting more questions on questions, but that's what I see in Austin now is a lot of the artists that, by default or by necessity, they're becoming way more civically engaged. Some that probably wouldn't have any reason to are now, they're definitely front and center now, where now developers are kind of sometimes skirting government bureaucracy and trying to talk to people that have artistic or cultural capital to think about development, and there's good and bad to that. Anyways, don't really have a point.
No, that was great. And I actually want to use that as the sort of jumping off point for you guys to each give us a brilliant closing thought. As you think about accountability, as you think about sovereignness, as you think about those issues, you've got a group of 300 extraordinary people who are working all across this country. We've spent 75 minutes together. What is something that we should walk away with in our heads from this conversation? What is one thing you want folks to sort of leave with? Not the thing, a thing. Less pressure.
I think the thing, well, I think the only thing I could really share is the biggest lesson that I've learned, right? And I think for those of you who are in maybe arts and community development or just in community development, when you work in community development, you think you know a lot. And you think you know a lot about neighborhoods because you've seen a lot. And I think as we work in communities, the one thing, and this goes, I'm hoping I'm responding to your comment about accountability, is being that open to change and what you think you know is really may not be the answer of what should be good community work. And it may be something completely different that you haven't thought of, that this neighborhood really wants to lead with, or that's really important to this neighborhood, or not important at all to this neighborhood. And then it takes you in a whole different direction. And so that has been the growth for me over the past 2 years in this role.
Rip, a profound thought.
Okay. I was looking for Ryan from Sidewalk Arts in Detroit yesterday. Hey. And she was asking my opinion about the extent to which she ought to engage with a particular set of developers beginning to work in neighborhoods. And the terms of that engagement. Should she contract with them? Should she do research for them? Should she even talk to them? And it's made me think over the course of the conversation that in some ways, I think, at least in Detroit, and I don't know in Philadelphia or in Austin whether this is true, but I think in some ways the arts are a little bit where philanthropy was a decade ago. There's a little bit of a reluctance to engage the private sector because their motives are different and there's all sorts of appropriation going on and all of the issues. A little bit of reluctance to tangle up with the public sector because it's bureaucratic and control-based and all sorts of complicated things. And even philanthropy, there's this kind of weird distortion of power dynamics there. And I think that the artists in Detroit who have really leaned into community work have begun to realize that they can navigate through those things. They can figure out their own relationship of mutuality with each one of those sectors. And I guess my advice, it's hardly profound, is not to shy away from that. Don't be every bit as clear as Ryan is about what her principles are and her limits are and the fence line of engagement is. But don't not do it because of preconceptions around the way those sectors behave. Because I think at the end of the day, this sort of reverse engineering is going to increasingly be characteristic of every urban and non-urban place in America. The idea that you sort of set these different objectives and then you begin as a community, as a civic community to backfill against them. And everyone will sort of play a different role. And for artists to sit that one out, I think would be a huge lost opportunity.
That's great. So tell us how we did. Did this feel like a hallway conversation? Yes? Did this feel good? All right, then join me in thanking Rip and Anika for doing this today.